Well, let's see. Where should I begin? It seems like a fair number of people, possibly even the majority of folks who view my videos, really like it when I make a video about a computer system or a piece of computer hardware. So, here for your viewing pleasure is yet another computer-related video. Hello everyone, uxwbill here once again, and today I'm going to be talking about the computer that you can see on your screen right now, which is specifically known as the Roach Palace Linux box. Now, the Linux part should certainly be obvious. I find that it's the Roach Palace part that usually needs a little bit of explanation. For those who don't know, the Roach Palace is a house situated on a piece of property that I bought. It was my intention from the start to remodel and renovate the house, but it soon became obvious that it was beyond that sort of help, and one of these days it will be torn down. Meanwhile, because the house is essentially uninhabitable and I actually had to turn the power off a few months ago because the lights were behaving very strangely in such a way that could have indicated some kind of arcing going on somewhere, I decided to play it safe and shut the power off to the house. Ever since that time, I have gradually been emptying it out, and the first room to receive my attention has been the so-called man cave. This was the computer that lived in the man cave. And I decided that after many years of not having run Linux, I had actually not run it since the early 2000s, I felt that it was probably only fair to give the Linux operating system another go-round. Now, of course, there was the decision to be made as concerns what distribution I would run, and I will actually get into that a moment later. Now, I don't know that I can go into all of the points that I would like to make in a cogent manner because it's fairly late at night, but suffice it to say that while I have a powerful amount of respect for what the Linux operating system stands for and the things that can be accomplished with it today, I'm not ready to become a user of Linux on a day-to-day basis. I still find that there are unfortunate pitfalls in the usability experience and stuff that doesn't work like it should as compared to other operating systems. Basically, what I would like to be able to do someday is to set my mother down in front of a Linux box and have her able to perform all the work that she does on her present-day computer, which is a Macintosh. I'll elaborate a little on this in the video description. Meanwhile, let's take a closer look at this computer. Now, for those of you who have watched my video concerning my never-completed new video editing PC, you'll probably think that this case looks very familiar. And you would be correct. Although I did eventually abandon that build and have plans to revisit it someday, this is actually a different example of the same Antec case. In this particular system, this case was probably overkill, but I do want to point out that I acquired this case in an open box sale for an extremely agreeable price. Which brings me to another point about this build. I could have easily arranged for this computer to be a golly gee whiz, no holds barred and no expenses spared, absolute screamer of a thing. But that's not my goal for most of my computer builds. I like value and decent performance in a computer build. And this build definitely focused on the value for money aspect. Almost everything that you will see here was either acquired open box, at salvage prices, or even at various auctions online. Now, if we have a look inside the front cover on the machine, you can see that most of the drive bays are actually empty. This case is actually somewhat terribly underutilized. However, there is the one thing that every real computer should have, an honest-to-goodness floppy drive. And then up here I have a very simple DVD reader and a compact disc reader as well. I didn't feel the need to install a writer in this machine. And as I remember it, I bought that drive for about $5. Now you might ask yourself, why would a person utilize such a large computer case for such a simple build? Well, the answer itself is pretty simple. I decided that it would be nice to have room for future expansion, plus the price at which this case was being offered for sale was so cheap that I couldn't have bought a smaller, simpler case for less. Plus, it has to be said, I really love the styling and design of this Antec case. If I remember correctly, this is the P182B model. Alright, so here we are looking at the side of the machine, which really isn't anything particularly fancy to look at. And you might be able to notice that there are places where this metal looks particularly distressed or folded out. from where it normally should be. It should be a nice flat sheet of metal that's pretty much featureless and even slightly reflective, as you can see from the Handycam's onboard light. Well, I discovered, much to my dismay, that apparently whatever adhesive Antec used to hold these metal panels onto the side of the case, it loses all of its sticking power when it's cold. When I drug this machine out of the Roach Palace and brought it over here, because the power's off at the Roach Palace and it's no longer being heated, it was about 30 degrees in the man cave, and that was sufficient to cause the adhesive not to work. Fortunately, in a warmer environment, the adhesive once again started to work, and it was possible to push the metal back into place with only the slightest of distortions, indicating that anything unfortunate had ever happened. Now, with the two thumb screws out, it is, at least in theory, I don't know if I can, there we go, I can do it one-handed. It is, at least in theory, possible to have a look inside the machine. It seems best, I suppose, to start from the beginning, and the beginning of most any computer build starts with a power supply. What we have here is an Nlight 450 watt power supply, admittedly overkill for a system like this, but it's always better to have a little too much power supply than it is not to have enough power supply to do what you want. And then over here in this removable cage, you will see that there is one serial ATA hard drive. As I remember it right, that is a 250 gigabyte Samsung hard drive. It didn't cost me a thing, as it was pulled from a computer that was heading to the scrapyard. Moving up a little bit, we have a sound card installed in one of the expansion slots. This is a Yamaha YMF724 based card. Probably a fairly low-end card in the grand scheme of things, but functional, and it sounds pretty good nevertheless. Moving up a couple of slots, you will see a FireWire card. This is an Adaptec card with a compact spare number on it. I have probably hundreds of FireWire cards kicking around here, and no, please don't ask if I'll sell you one, because I prefer not to do such things on YouTube. The main reason for choosing this particular card has to do with the fact that it has a header-style connector on the back of it that allows me to make use of the FireWire port mounted on the front of the case. Now, I have not actually attempted to use any FireWire devices with this system beyond simple hard drives, but the FireWire 400 ports are there if I want them. You have probably noticed that this is a pretty serious-looking motherboard. It's got a large number of expansion slots. It also has a PCI X, not to be confused with the later PCI Express slot. And you will notice that there is no graphics slot. That is because this is a server-grade motherboard. Specifically, this is the Supermicro P8 SCT, a board that I had used with excellent results in the past to build machines that had, for whatever reason, a need for lots of expansion card installation. At least one of those builds was a machine that I put together for work that ended up running as the heart of a 16-channel DVR system. It was very difficult for me at the time, when this board was brand new in the earlier 2000s, I think around 2006 or so, to find a motherboard that offered the onboard peripherals that I wanted to have, and also the number of available expansion slots. Again, this motherboard was acquired with an eye on value. I bought this board in a gutted rack mount server case from a bankrupt company. I gave $1 for it without memory or processor installed. The installed memory is 2 gigabytes of DDR2. I believe it's PC2 5300. This board could support, I want to say, up to 8 gigabytes at least. It has 2 gigabit network interface controllers on board, both of them from Broadcom. You can see them sitting there in front of the PCI slots. You can also see how I've installed up here in the topmost slot, which is not used with this particular motherboard, an adapter to break out one of the normally unused USB headers on this motherboard and make it possible to accomplish something useful with it. Now, this particular motherboard is based on Intel's so-called Copper River platform. And again, I'm trusting my memory here, which may not be a great idea. You have the Copper River North Bridge up here next to the processor. Then you have the controller for the PCI X slot, which is what's located under that green heatsink right there. Down at the bottom of the board, behind the PCI slots and partially obscured, is the Intel ICH South Bridge, and I believe, someone will probably correct me on this if I'm wrong, that this is either an ICH5 or an ICH6R, which is a variant of the chipset that supports at least software RAID for the attached serial ATA hard drives. This is not the highest end model of this board from Supermicro. There was actually a higher end model still that featured an LSI Logic hardware RAID controller on the motherboard, but I did not feel the need to have that kind of extravagance. This is, as you can see, a really nice motherboard even today, and I could not have gone very far wrong purchasing it for $1 from the company that was selling it. Now, going on with the tour, some of you may have noticed this peculiar card that is installed in a slot in front of the Intel South Bridge. This is an item known as an out-of-band management controller. When you have a server board such as this one, or any particularly mission-critical piece of equipment, you may sometimes need to be able to administer it remotely, and you might need to be able to do so even if the software on the machine has completely stopped functioning. For example, it might be that you need to get into the setup utility, or you might need to get into the RAID administration utility when the operating system won't boot or cannot get to a point where other remote control tools would be available. This board contains a small computer of its own that can control the board's power state, and it also provides access to a text-only serial console from which programs that are operating in a text-only mode, such as the BIOS setup utility, may be accessed. Unfortunately, this board's functionality is kind of limited by two particular things. I can't help but think that it was a very odd choice for Supermicro to design the software used to access this card in Java. Now, I know that they were probably trying to establish a platform-independent way of controlling and talking to this board from over the network, but in that case, why didn't they just use some more common protocols like, say, Telnet, a web-based interface, SSH, something like that? Anything would have been better than the extremely hokey Java-based user interface and application that they chose to use. This card actually communicates over the first Ethernet port, however it does not disable the Ethernet controller from being used by the operating system and the user's own applications. Now, looking down here in the corner, you can see, obscured behind this tucked up IDE ribbon cable, a couple of serial ATA connectors. There are a total of 4 of them. You can see that one of them has my hard drive plugged into it. There is a parallel ATA channel on this board, and that actually goes to the CD-ROM drive, where you can see I've tapped power for a fan. And then, of course, the floppy drive is hiding back in there. You can just see it. I'm not a big believer, before anyone criticizes me about the arrangement of cables in this machine, I'm really not a big believer at all in zip tying stuff to within an inch of its life. It only serves to annoy me, and it makes me think harmful thoughts toward other people who do that sort of thing when they build computers. As I said previously, there's really only one complaint that I have concerning this board, and that is the fact that for whatever reason, although the low pin count I/O controller is capable of doing so, Supermicro never saw fit to enable fan speed control on this board. It monitors power supply voltages and it monitors the fan speed, but any fan that is plugged into the headers on this motherboard that are provided to connect fans to will be running at full throttle. And in the case of this CPU fan, that is, as you may have guessed, extremely loud. Now, you might be looking at this cooler and saying, my, that is an unusual CPU cooler. Indeed it is. This is something from Dynatron of Taiwan. It is a very serious heat pipe style cooler. That is to say that there are 2 oil-filled heat pipes that run up the length of this cooler, and that is actually a highly efficient design. There is also one other thing I would like to point out about this particular cooler that resulted in my choosing it, not the least of which was the fact that I bought it as slightly damaged scrap. And there, folks, is one of the things that happens when you trust your memory far too much. I actually thought that portions of the back of the motherboard were visible from the other side of the case, but it seems that such is not, well, the case, no pun intended. So you'll have to take my word for it that this CPU cooler uses a different mounting scheme, one that I much prefer, and one whose use I am not totally sure why the reasoning behind abandoning it was given, but I don't like it. This cooler actually uses an X-shaped piece of metal that fastens to the other side of the motherboard and is actually held in place tightly by these screws that you can see right here. There are two more complementing it down here. I have heard that perhaps this resulted in undue stress on the motherboard, that it might result in the board bending and possibly becoming broken, or even potentially damaging the processor or the LGA 775 socket. But in this case, this setup works great. And I won't venture too far into profanity here, but I will say that those plastic push-through pin style Pentium 4 LGA 775 coolers are asinine. I can't stand those things, and I avoid them wherever I can. Now, when I was zoomed in and looking at the screws here, you may have noticed that some of the wires are not connected to the cooler itself. That is because the yellow wire was actually cut, and of course the yellow wire is what powers the fan. That's probably why, again, I bought this cooler for, about 75 cents or so. Fortunately, that wasn't a problem. It worked out perfectly and to my advantage, considering the non-functional fan speed control hardware on this motherboard. So what I have done to keep the fan running nice and quietly, otherwise it sounded like it was about to take on a wood chipper in terms of noise level, I simply wired it in to this power connector up here that's going into the CD-ROM drive, and I powered it directly from the 5-volt DC line. It still moves more than enough air over this processor to keep it perfectly cool, even under 100% loaded conditions. Now, the processor itself is probably the only thing that I really didn't go quite as high-end as I'd hoped to. This is a Pentium 4 520 series microprocessor. I believe it's a Prescott core. Pretty nice little chip, but it doesn't support 64-bit computing, so at least for the time being, this machine is confined to 32-bit only computing. However, that's not a problem, as with 2 gigabytes of memory installed and all that good stuff, I really haven't found myself in the need of anything that a 64-bit operating system of any kind could do for me on this machine. And speaking of the operating system, let me go ahead, slap this thing back together, get it hooked up, and I'll show you what particular operating system I am running. But first, here's a quick look at some of the major points on the back. Up at the top, we have 2 sets of fan switches, one that governs the operating speed of the top fan, seen here shrouded by a fancy-looking thing that I believe Antec referred to as a spoiler. You have the usual card of legacy ports on this motherboard. There are also a set of USB ports on the back here, and of course the connections for the 2 gigabit Ethernet interfaces. There is the rear fan. Its speed is governed by this switch over here. Then you have the expansion slots. The USB ports are broken out here. A little further down we find the FireWire connections, and then finally on the bottom are the ports representing the sound card, starting with a connector for a joystick, the various line in, line out, and microphone inputs, and then finally a coaxial digital output whose functionality I have never needed. These 2 rubber grommets, for anyone wondering about them, are intended for use with a water cooling setup, something that I have personally never played with. I know, hold your surprised reactions. And then of course on the bottom we have the good old Enlight 450 watt power supply, which proudly boasts on its fan of featuring a so-called silent engine, which in this case is just a fan controller. And I can say that it definitely works. When this power supply gets hot, it definitely makes a fair amount of racket, which I would much rather it do as opposed to quietly blowing itself up in the name of remaining silent. So, with the hardware details of this computer out of the way, it's just about time to take a look at the software side of things. I've gone ahead and hooked everything up here to power this machine on for the first time in, probably several months at least. You can see I have a 15-inch Samsung flat panel display here, followed by the One True keyboard, actually one of the few that I have with the 10-foot long server-style attachment cable that allowed you to more easily and realistically place your computer on the floor back in the day. And then I have something that you certainly won't see every day. Now, as proof that I am nothing if not an optimist, despite years of experience to the contrary in my work with computers, I have here a Logitech 3-button computer mouse. The reason I say that I am an optimist has to do with the fact that it wasn't very long ago that this particular mouse was absolutely coated in muck from the 2004 basement flood. And so I am optimistically assuming that it is still functional. Likewise, I am also optimistically assuming that the computer still works, though it certainly should. Now, some of you may have noticed that there is the occasional flash from a blue light in here, even though the power is off. Antec actually provided an extra hard drive LED or two with this case in the event that you were running something like, say, a SCSI disk controller or some other add-in hard drive controller than the one provided on the motherboard. Now, I, of course, am not doing so, but I decided to make use of the light not only because Supermicro provided a header or two on the board that would allow you to attach a light to indicate the status of the onboard Ethernet adapters, but also because the more blinking lights, the merrier, as far as I'm concerned. Now, one thing you will notice about this system when I power it up is that despite all the fans in this case, it really is surprisingly quiet. So here we go. Time for the official smoke test. Power light came on. Just listen to how quiet those fans are. And we have a power on self-test, so things are definitely looking good. Let's go ahead and pop into system setup here. You can see the 2 gigabytes of memory. I think I spoke in error. This machine says it has DDR2 533 memory in it, which I believe would make that PC2 4200 memory. And the date is set correctly in the system setup utility. That is not the actual time in this part of the world. However, this machine is running, as previously mentioned, a Unix-style operating system, and most of those operating systems choose to keep the system clock set to GMT and then calculate the needed offset in software. So the time that you see right now is actually Greenwich Mean Time. And then, of course, there is the legacy diskette drive A 1.44 megabyte 3.5-inch unit, followed by an OptiArc DVD-ROM. I really thought that was perhaps a Samsung drive, but it appears not to be. However, the hard drive is definitely a Samsung 250 gigabyte model, and then, of course, the system will halt on all errors. Now, you may have noticed during the power on self-test that this system claimed the use of shared video memory. I have simply been using the onboard Intel Copper River graphics since I don't do any gaming or anything real high-end on this machine. The onboard Intel graphics are more than sufficient for my needs. I don't think there's too much to look at inside the system setup features. However, the console redirection feature is sort of interesting. This is how the out-of-band management card gets a hold of the system console. The core software, the BIOS in this case, actually provides a redirection to a serial port that is brought out to the out-of-band management card, thus allowing the system console to be accessed remotely, at least in theory. And of course, we can also take a look at the hardware monitor. You can see the temperatures inside the system are pretty reasonable. It's actually fairly cool down here in the basement. There's the speed of the CPU fan cruising along at a rather leisurely speed. Its maximum speed is, as best I remember, somewhere around a rip-roaring 7,000 RPM or so. And while there is a fan speed control entry in here, it doesn't actually seem to do anything that I have noticed. This board would allow you to overclock it, I do believe, but I have not played with that on this particular system either. You may have noticed there's a bit of a delay as I move around the pages of the setup program. This has to do with the console redirection, because not only is it being brought out to the PS2 port and the onboard graphics, it's also being provided to the out-of-band management card. Anyway, let's go ahead and reboot this thing. and just see if it does in fact still happen to start up. Takes just a moment for the system to initialize itself and bring up the video. I'm not going to make you sit through the entire memory count here. There's a floppy drive seek. It detects the various drives. And look at this, folks. I think we're going to be off and running in just a moment here. Yep. It's thinking about it. And there we have the Linux Mint startup screen. Here now is the login screen. You can see that I got very creative with the host name on this computer. That is really, that was really difficult to come up with, I'll promise you that. And then you see not only my user account, but that of my brother. And gosh, I hope that I remember my password, because having to root my own machine would not be a whole heck of a lot of fun. Here is my logged in desktop. I had no problem at all remembering my password. In fact, I got it right on the first try, which is usually how things go. I've got a pretty good mind for remembering that stuff. Anyway, as previously mentioned, this machine is running Linux. Specifically, it is running a rather outdated release of Linux Mint. You can see right there, it is version 8. Now, I don't mean to sound snarky when I talk about the Linux operating system, but it and I have not always gotten along perfectly. One of the things that kind of drives me up the wall about it is being told, oh, you know, something is easy, and then you find out that you've landed in some kind of unmitigated crash landing situation, and you're really not feeling very good at all. Again, I encourage you to read the video description so as to understand better where I'm coming from when I say that. It's something that I can't explain particularly concisely, but hopefully some of the stuff in the video description will help you understand my perspective on it. I did get a surprise when I logged into this machine. It's not much of a secret that I'm left-handed, but like most of us southpaws, I'm forced to exist in a world dominated by the majority of people who are right-handed. And so very often when I use a computer mouse, I simply use it right-handed like everyone else does. But for some reason, when I was working with this particular machine, I actually configured the mouse to work with a left-handed layout, as you can see right there. So that's definitely a little bit different. I should upgrade the operating system on this machine since it is completely obsolete. I'm not sure how much of an adventure that's going to be. Hopefully the people who produce this distribution have given upgrades some thought, especially upgrades from particularly, shall we say, archaic releases to the current one. I apologize in advance for the awkward offset camera angle here, but it's about the best I can do while actually still being able to maintain control of the computer and demonstrate some of the particular aspects of the software on this machine to you. Now, I looked around at some of the files that I had kept on this computer, and it appears that the last time I used this machine for anything was around the beginning of November 2011. Specifically, I found a couple of hilarious, or at least moderately funny, screenshots from various blog TV shows on here, the most recent of which was dated, I think, November 11th or so. Using this machine goes along pretty well. It runs pretty nicely. You can see I just brought up the Composer HTML editor there. And, whoops. Oh gosh, I set the mouse to use the left-handed configuration, and then I don't know why I did that. That really doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not sure what I was thinking at the time because, yeah, I use the mouse all the time. Even if I switch hands, I'll just switch the function of my fingers on the buttons without actually changing them in software. So I have no idea why it is that I did that. I'll go into Mozilla Thunderbird Mail here. I can't imagine why I had a mail client set up on this computer, although the reason has just become obvious. Clearly I was reading Usenet News on this computer back when I was using it actively. That's something I haven't done in a while. I should probably check in on some of the news groups that I used to frequent. And of course, there is a web browser, Firefox. Probably, if I had to guess, an archaic version. I'm going to go ahead and skip those updates just for the sake of video brevity and to maintain a relatively high level of concise discussion about what's going on here while I try to knock over the handy cam. Oh gosh, where should we go to see if this thing actually has a connection to the web? Oh, I know. We'll go to YouTube's best channel. And you know that's true because I read it on the internet. Well, there's not too much to say about the software on this machine. You can see how it moves along. You can also see that this is definitely an older, or shall I say downright elderly version of Firefox, version 3.6.17. Certainly not the end of life for the 3.6 branch of Firefox, but obviously as far as it ever got on this machine, because it is claiming, according to the Mint update tool, that all of the software on this machine is up to date. I am personally of the opinion, because I have obnoxious opinions and I feel as though I must share them with my lovely YouTube viewing community, I'm of the opinion that Firefox 3.6 was maybe not the last really great Firefox release, but it was really a good release of Firefox, and I was sorry to see it ride off into the sunset, especially since I am one of those folks who has not been particularly impressed with the fact that the Mozilla organization has moved Firefox to a rapid release schedule. Apparently, they think they ought to be Google Chrome or something, and some of their user community, myself included, definitely does not like that. Before I go ahead and shut this down, I guess I'll go ahead and punch up something like OpenOffice here. You can see this machine definitely zips right along. I'll go ahead and just type something in at random here. Whoops. And of course a little shameless plug there at the bottom. So there you have it, folks. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you found it useful and informative. By all means, feel free to leave a comment if you have one.